So hello, I hope you're doing good. And hopefully my mic does well today because it's really windy where I am. So there's this great tree right outside my window and the branches keep scratching at the window. It's a great sound. I don't know if you can hear it, but anyway, welcome. You're most welcome here. And this is episode 51, which is just wow. Yeah, kind of mind-blowing for me, but I'm really enjoying this so much. And this is really me reading a book. And this book is On the Path, an anthology on the Noble Eightfold Path, drawn from the Pāli Canon. And it's written by Ṭhānissaro Bhikkhu, an American Buddhist monk who's widely respected for his translations of Buddhist texts and his teachings on meditation and the Dhamma. And I'm really grateful that he put this book in the Creative Commons so that it's free. So if you open up the description to this video, you'll see a link to this free book. And it also lets people like me read it, comment on it, etc., without having to pay royalties. So thank you as long as I don't profit from it, which I'm not. So thank you so much for that as well. And I bow to you very deeply. And so before we get into it today, particularly if you are new to this podcast, I also want to say that I am not a scholar. I have never been ordained. So I say this every episode, if you are here because you're interested in Buddhism, it is the lens through which I perceive reality and have since I was in my very, very early 20s and had experience beyond a textbook or a classroom with Buddhism. So that's kind of where I'm coming from. So please do not look to me for, I'm not your man, I'm not your woman. And I would just say, if you're really interested in Buddhism, I truly hope that you will, visit YouTube or whatever you use and explore the rich history of Buddhism. And it occurs to me that I should make a playlist of videos that I like, in case you're interested. And these isn't necessarily, these are the videos that I am sanctioning, although in a way they are, they would be videos that I think accurately reflect what the historical Buddha Siddhartha Gautama taught. But yeah, I'm a lay person. Yeah, I'm messy. And so there you go. And we've been in chapter 2 in Right Resolve for several episodes now. Right Resolve, the second quote unquote right that Ṭhānissaro Bhikkhu presents in this beautiful book. So of the Eightfold Path, he's presenting Right Resolve, and that's what we're visiting now. And then you can listen to earlier episodes to take a listen to Right View. But today we're wrapping up Right Resolve, and I don't really do a summary, and so I'm just going to jump right back in to where we left off. And so if you are following along in the digital book, again the link is in the description here, then I'm on the middle of page 275, Sutta 162. So here we go. Then Venerable Ananda, together with Tapussa the householder, went to the Blessed One, and on arrival, having bowed down to him, sat to one side. As he was sitting there, he said to the Blessed One, "Tapussa the householder here has said to me, 'Venerable Ananda, sir, we are householders who indulge in sensuality, delight in sensuality, enjoy sensuality, rejoice in sensuality. For us, indulging in sensuality, delighting in sensuality, enjoying sensuality, rejoicing in sensuality, renunciation seems like a sheer drop-off. Yet I've heard that in this Dhamma and Vinaya, the hearts of the very young monks leap up at renunciation, grow confident, steadfast, and firm, seeing it as peace. So right here is where this Dhamma and Vinaya is contrary to the great mass of people, i.e., and then in brackets, this issue of renunciation. So it is, Ananda. So it is. Even I, myself, before my self-awakening, when I was still just an unawakened bodhisattva, thought, Renunciation is good, seclusion is good, but my heart didn't leap up at renunciation, didn't grow confident, steadfast, or firm, seeing that is peace. The thought occurred to me, what is the cause? What is the reason why my heart doesn't leap up at renunciation, doesn't grow confident, steadfast, or firm, seeing that is peace? Then the thought occurred to me, I haven't seen the drawback of sensuality. I haven't pursued, and then in brackets, that theme. I haven't understood the reward of renunciation. I haven't familiarized myself with it. That's why my heart doesn't leap up at renunciation, doesn't grow confident, steadfast, or firm, seeing that is peace. Then the thought occurred to me, if, having seen the drawback of sensuality, I were to pursue that theme, and if, having understood the reward of renunciation, I were to familiarize myself with it, there's the possibility that my heart would leap up at renunciation, grow confident, steadfast, and firm, seeing that is peace. So at a later time, having seen the drawback of sensuality, I pursued that theme. Having understood the reward of renunciation, I familiarized myself with it. My heart leapt up at renunciation, grew confident, steadfast, and firm, seeing that is peace. Then, quite secluded from sensuality, secluded from unskillful dhammas, I entered and remained in the first jhana, and that comes from AN 9:41. Okay, so also, if you're new to the podcast, then it's important that I let you know that I absolutely do use AI. Sometimes I will arm wrestle it to the ground, working with it to kind of help me get at a way to articulate how I understand Buddhism. And again, I want to reiterate, I'm not a scholar, I'm not a monastic, but I am a lot like, or maybe not a lot like, but I can relate to Tapusa, because much like a yaka from previous episodes, yaka isn't a name, it's a thing. So yaka is that non-human spirit being that was in last episode, maybe the episode before that, and that conversation. But a tapusa is a householder, a layperson. And so I wanted to go to AI to kind of get a cultural reference because I didn't know if tapusa was a person or a thing. And I assumed it was a person, just like I did the yaka. So let me tell you about it. Here's what Robot had to say. A tapusa, apparently, in Siddhartha Gautama's time, is a human merchant. So just a regular, we're all regular people at the end of the day, right? Siddhartha Gautama, Buddha, whatever, it wasn't a god, it was just a person, who had experienced something and wanted to share it. But tapusa is a human merchant. So a business person. And tapusa is also a very early lay follower of the Buddha. So again, this is of the Theravāda tradition, kind of looking at, the Pāli Canon and what appears to be on record. Lots of debate. You'll find that for yourself as well, about who and how old all of these concepts are and where they come from. Again, not my lane. Interestingly, also, I asked Robot to kind of compare these two in terms of the role they play. I guess you could say from an avatar perspective, or just their function, like in a Greek chorus. If you think about what is the role. So you'll have the ordinary citizen, you'll have the elder, of the city, the wise one, the sage. You'll have the women of the community. You'll have sailors, servants, or townspeople. So you'll have these characters, these avatars, and that's what I'm thinking of here when I think about these roles that have kind of appeared in the suttas in the last few weeks. Anyway, I digress. So what did Robot? And also, if this is your first episode, I always begin my prompting with AI as follows. It will be some derivative of, here's the sutta, copy, paste, and unpack it and explain it like I'm 5. And I don't do that assuming that you're 5. I'm actually doing that for me because I find that it is impossible for me to talk about something if I can't, I need it to make sense for me to be able to talk about it, So anyway, I don't even know if that made sense, but there you go. So here's what Robot had to say. Now that we all know what a tapusa is, a normal householder. And in this particular sutta, the normal householder is saying, man, this is hard. Right? We like sensual pleasure. It's great. We kind of love it. It's kind of amazing. It's kind of wow. It's kind of what? It's kind of ooh. And I love the wording here. Wait, let me go back. Just let me find that. Okay, where was it? He says, for us, indulging in sensuality, delighting in sensuality, enjoying sensuality, rejoicing in sensuality. I mean, there's a lot going on there, right? I mean, and then he says, renunciation seems like a sheer drop off. I'm sorry. And it is. It is. If you have any passing interest in Buddhism and you really want to get at the heart experientially, which of course the whatever Buddha said is see for yourself, then I think a great way to think about how hilarious, to my view, this idea of the sheer drop-off, because it is absolutely subjectively, experientially, a sheer drop-off. If you ever do a long-term retreat wherein it's rigorous, and some, are so rigorous that, you might be ejected if you make eye contact. It's not to be punitive. That's not the function of it. And forming mental words, not just the sense media of sound and sight, but also the formation of mental words that are required in speaking. When we shut all of that down for a long period of time, like Siddhartha Gautama, later to become a Buddha, said we needed to do to experience what he is talking about, we have to do that. Because really what the Blessed One, what Buddha is describing here in response to Tapusa the householder, it is required. And yeah, it is a drop off. And I'll kind of talk more about how, when the Buddha says, when I really started to contemplate it as a theme, contemplation, but I'll get to that in a moment. So when you go to, and I'm sure there's all different kinds out there. And I'm not an expert in any of this. And so the longest one though, that I've ever done, it's nothing compared to, what a lot of really serious, even householder, serious practitioners will do. As I went to an 11-day, very rigorous retreat. And in that retreat, we practiced noble silence, which means you did not speak for 11 days, period. You didn't speak, not even to yourself out loud. That sensory media, mental formation, all of the things that require uttering some kind of language, all of that's just immediately taken right off the table for you unless you violate it, right? I don't want to go off the rails here. I'll just say, to my view, if you're serious about practicing Buddhism, when you're meditating every day for 9 hours, kind of sitting upright, not moving, following the breath, and then in the particular retreat that I did, it was a particular form of Vipassana that comes from the Goenka tradition, where you're really kind of scanning. You're just but you don't even begin that until you actually just practice good old-fashioned concentration meditation for the first hour or two. And so this is happening every single day, right? 9 hours a day of meditation, beginning with concentration meditation, shifting over into Goenka, the Goenka's personification of Vipassana in ancient Buddhism. So you're doing this, right? And, you're only eating 2 meals a day. So you're also kind of limiting that sense gate, right? Of that kind of craving. And some of you know I come from an eating disordered background. Buddhism was key to my recovering from bulimia, among other things, 12-step programs, therapy, all the things. Again, I'm not saying you should do that. I'm just telling you what was going on for me. And so, so for me personally, going to this retreat for 11 days, that aspect of no long, eating stopped, the kitchen was closed at noon every day. And so now I've got that huge craving and all of the gestalt of my relationship to food and fear and all of the deep well of feeling like I'll be devoured if I can't eat. And it was a deep pool. And maybe some of you are interested in Jung and kind of the archetypes that he talks about what you might actually experience from a narrative perspective when you engage in practices like this. And I think, so you've got that going on, and you can't make eye contact with anyone, which I found fascinating. And speaking of sensuality, very sensual in a way. And so I had to work with that. But I'm getting to the point. So I was experiencing what anyone would experience who wasn't just freaking maybe hardcore or whatever the fabrication is. I don't want to come across as, look, I have arthritis in my hip and I'm never not in pain. Okay, so I certainly don't want to come across as, pain schmain. Not at all. In fact, I couldn't do a retreat like that right now if I had to sit the whole time. I would have to, even now, about an hour's about as good as I can go. And I haven't really, there's a lot going on there that, is mine to continue to work on as I can, et cetera, et cetera. But I'll say that how I dealt with that at the retreat was, when I couldn't take the pain anymore, I didn't want to just, I wanted to see it through. And I needed to practice radical acceptance about the physical pain, or I knew I would leave. I would just leave, because I remember spending an entire day at the retreat, maybe day 6 or 7 or something, I don't remember, not really meditating, but mostly kind of figuring out how I could duck out and trying to convince myself why I should duck out, and kind of playing, I don't want to say playing mental games, because it makes it sound like it's some frivolous thing that we're aware that we're doing, and it's not. When we're in it, it's quite serious. I can't handle this. This is too much. What if I'm damaging myself? What if something? So I don't want to trivialize anything here. This can be dangerous. Just like taking heroic doses of mushrooms can be dangerous, man. I've had incredible, and I'm just saying, go back and when I was young, I wasn't doing it in a smart way, but I've had a lot of experiences with, I'll just say I had an interesting young adulthood in relationship to drugs. And anyway, I don't want to get off on drugs either, okay? I've already lost the algorithm, so whatever. The drop-off. I'm trying to describe to you the drop-off. When you remove sensual pleasure. And I realized that took a long time to do it, but it really is a drop-off, And so here the Buddha says, I get it, And so it is. And so it is, And he said, look, I get it, you've heard that people who come and follow me, man, they got a fire in their belly. We're in right resolve, right? So they and I've talked in previous episodes about the fire in my belly that I've always had, and was born with the fire in my belly that, and again, this is not a judgment. Everybody's different, right? But that fire, in fact, the nun I just talked about said that she experienced a fire in her belly from a very young age. It's that he's saying, look, this drop off that this requires, I don't have that fire in my belly. And I actually like to go out, and I actually like to have good sex and have a couple drinks and have really delicious food and try to beat that guy over there and getting what I want, or whatever. I don't know. I didn't live back then. I don't know. I'm making stuff up right now, but I'm trying to draw a correlation, right? He's saying, look, I don't have the fire in my belly that you're talking about. And what this path requires, it's a pretty steep ask, man. And the Buddha agrees and says, yeah, look, when I started this, I don't have a fire in my belly. I don't have a fire in my belly. Well, he must have had some fire in his belly, or he wouldn't have set out, right? And if you go, and again, I think it's, Hermann Hesse, there we go. If you read, I think it's Hermann Hesse who wrote Siddhartha. And actually, that was how I was introduced to Buddhism, was finding that beautiful, beautiful book, which it's a book of fiction, but to my understanding is truly based on what we know of Siddhartha Gautama, the historical figure, just like just like Christians, the historical figure of Christ. He did have something happen that was like, what? When he was older, right? When he was already married and, something happened to him and it planted the seed of resolve. But he's saying, I didn't experience just a complete yeah, woohoo, I'm going to put on some robes. I'm not going to have any sex ever. I'm never going to imbibe in anything that gives me pleasure. Yeah, I cannot wait. And yes, there are some minds, right? If you go back and you listen to Sister Dhammadina, and so, some of these people back in Siddhartha, after he became the Buddha and was teaching back in his time, they were hardcore. Maybe they were even born as some of the, they had a deep resolve. In Buddhism, I guess you would say, and I don't know, I try to avoid Hinduism because I respect it. And Buddha came up in the Vedas and other things that I know nothing about. But I'll just say that I think all of those traditions, those non-dual traditions, would say, well, that is their karmic seeds ripening. Somebody comes into the world and at 5 or 6 has this incredibly profound, deep resolve, would be karmic seeds ripening. They would say, all of it, Buddhism included, and I don't want to speak too much to that. So how did the Buddha deal with that? Because he didn't have that. He didn't have that it was more of like, wow, I've been living in this shiny pearly gates my whole life with having sex with whoever I want. I had all my flock of, not seagulls, folks. Come on, 80s people. I had all my women. I had all my money. I had all my, all my castles, kind of supporting me, lifting me up, surrounding me, and, presented with death, presented with disease. That's a wake-up call after a fashion, right? But it wasn't this incredible, profound right resolve that some of these people who became ordained and followed Buddha until their death, had in their belly. And it was the same fire that I had in my belly. It was just like a fierce. He says, well, here's what I did. And so he says, well, he realized he'd never really thought about the drawbacks of sensuality. A lot of people who are really devout, even though, am I a good Buddhist? No. Am I a devout Buddhist? Yes. I think you'll find that a lot of people that are really devout, they come from what the Buddha is describing here. He said, yeah, I didn't really experience any of that fire in my belly either. I was like, hey, actually, I appreciated that renunciation was good. Like, I got it theoretically. Now I'm adding words. He didn't say theoretically, but he said, right, renunciation is good. Seclusion is good, So he acknowledged, I recognize that. But he said, but his heart didn't have that right resolve, that fierce, right? And what I think what's coming to mind for me here, which was talked about in earlier sections of the book, and I'm sure will be revisited. In Tibetan Buddhism, there's the idea of wrathful compassion. And it sounds like an oxymoron, right? It's like, wait a minute. You can't be wrathful and experience compassion at the same time. Wait for it. What it symbolizes, to my understanding, and you've probably seen these, if you've ever gone to a museum or maybe you've been to these cultural, historical regions where Buddhism began, its origin territory, right? Then you probably have seen these masks or sculptures or artwork that depicts the wrathful compassion. They look terrifying, fierce, but the anger is not hatred. I think in the West, I'll try to keep this short. There can tend to be a real, very subtle confusion between anger and hatred. Like anger is hatred. No, not in Buddhism. Anger is not hatred. Wrathful compassion with wisdom. It's the forceful removal of ignorance and harmful behavior. And when I just said, sometimes when you hear people from the Theravāda tradition talking, they sound very abrupt sometimes. Sometimes I am forceful, right? If you've listened because to my view, it's, in my experience, it's what was required of me But also I did have that fire in my belly, because of how much pain I was in. Again, go back and listen to previous episodes. And so a lot of times people who have come from extreme pain, maybe really difficult childhoods, extreme addiction, maybe from their families, or maybe they themselves struggle with, or whatever it is, there's a lot of pain there. There's a lot of, and if it gets painful enough, very true for me, what happens, and this is very dangerous, because if you identify with this, then you miss the, well, anyway, I don't want to go, again, I'm just going way off the deep end. I'm going to come on back. I'm just going to bring it on back, sir. Bring it on back. Compassion with wisdom. This sutta is talking about what happens when you don't have that fire in the belly, and what can you do? And the Buddha is saying, well, you can contemplate. The theme is the word, right? That's Ṭhānissaro put in brackets here. You can think about that. What are the harmful potential downstream effects of sensuality, Epstein, etc.? And so if you can really sit down and take time to think about all the possible downstream effects of sensuality, then you can start to maybe dip the toe into the experiential downstream effects that are negative in relationship to sensuality. So this is really subtle stuff. And I think that people who have a lived experience of the negative effects of sensuality, again, I told you about my, some of the things that happened to me as a child, and I feel, look, my story is nothing. It's absolutely nothing, okay, compared to a lot of other people. So people who know for themselves, because they are on the receiving end of the downstream effects of the poison relationship to sensuality, they have a very distinct understanding of this. And it certainly has for me, it's made me a force to be reckoned with, I might add. If you cultivate that, be careful about the hatred though, because that's where it can, right, Epstein, that's where it can become really, dangerous. You can cultivate right resolve. Just have to be careful. And now I'm adding my own, I needed, and, for the most part, don't continue to need. But as I mentioned a few episodes ago, when more and more information about the Epstein files came out, it brought up the wrathful compassion. So I hadn't been that triggered. I hadn't been that triggered in a really long time, probably in like 30 years, In this practice, when the practitioner is triggered, it's an opportunity to practice. And again, if you went and you listened to that episode, which I have to warn you, I swear a lot, and you got to hear, how angry, right, and how kind of violent I can be when triggered. You probably heard it in my voice, and I kind of get to transmute that through the practice, but that resolve, right? And so he's saying, well, how about you think about it? I mean, yeah, it's great to get laid. It's great to get drunk or whatever. It feels so great when you're drunk and then you get laid, whatever. I don't know, whatever the jam is these days. I don't know if people are getting drunk or getting laid anymore. I really don't know, but I'm a Gen Xer. We were getting drunk. We were doing mushrooms and ecstasy and pot and getting laid and all the things. That was that time. I'm not saying you should do that. I'm really not saying that you should do that. I'm just saying I was a punk rocker and that's what I did. And you can judge me and you can do whatever the fuck you want, right? If you can touch into this through considering the downstream effects that are not so great about sensuality, it can help you cultivate right resolve, manufacture it. So the last episode, to my view, there was a sutta in there, you could go back and listen, go back and read it, that is everybody's going to find what they need. But for me, when I read it, I'd read it before, it'd been a long time, but when I read it again, I just thought, damn, man, this is it. This is for me. This is the thing. And it, it's not like this is the only place he said it, but it's one of the more kind of plain, very blunt, clear, succinct ways of saying it. You are what you think about. And not in that like cosmic BS, F you, Deepak Chopra sort of way. I mean, seriously, depending on our conditions, our fabricated conditions, there is a tiny, tiny crack there somewhere in your lived experience. There's a tiny crack that you can make bigger and bigger and bigger. And how you make the crack bigger is through right resolve. And that can look all different kinds of ways. But Buddha here is saying, well, I thought about the negative aspects. Like, think about this for a minute. And who knows what it would have taken, maybe a lightning bolt to like come through the sky and just fucking booshka. But can you imagine when Epstein was sitting there with 12-year-olds on his lap, or whatever the case may be, or whatever the story, whatever people like that do with whatever they're into, whatever that kind of mind produces? Can you imagine what would happen if, in a flash, they had direct embodied experience of what it was like to be on the receiving end of that harm? Can you imagine? Yeah. So people do have that experience, but I think it's probably pretty rare. And so I think what probably all religions do, and yes, Buddhism is a religion, I guess. I don't know. I mean, is it? I don't even know. Okay, I hate that word. That relationship, okay, so maybe you didn't try to kill yourself. Maybe you aren't, maybe you didn't come to Christianity or Catholicism or Buddhism. Maybe you didn't come up in it. Maybe you came later because you were addicted to heroin, and it was either do this 12-step and figure out how to find a higher power. I don't know what the hell that's going to be, but the 12 steps have Christian origins, and if that works, fantastic. You just want to get off the heroin, right? So whatever it is that cultivates and creates that earnestness, that right resolve. And maybe nothing made you that hungry, Maybe nothing is making you that hungry right now. Or maybe you're listening to this right now, if you're here, because you're getting really hungry and it's getting bad. Or maybe you're just a little bit hungry and you're like, I think I'm hungry. What is that? I don't like it. What is that? But whatever it is, you can cultivate this by thinking about the downstream effects, the downstream effects. And one of the ways that I think we can help think about the downstream effects, one of the ways that we can actually pop that hood open, if that doesn't feel available, is to do what Buddha told us to do in the last couple suttas. Sit your ass down on a mat, force yourself to wish everybody everywhere to be happy and mean it. Every time your mind wanders, bring it back and break your mind. I know I did. I'm not saying I'm like awake or anything. I'm just saying it does require a breaking of the mind, but that's not a big deal to a Buddhist view, because the mind, it's just fabric. So that's what's going on in this sutta, is my understanding. Okay, let me make sure I hit on everything there. I don't think I left anything out. Okay, so yeah, he's saying you can do that. Yeah, if I've seen the drawback and I pursue that theme, and then I understand the reward that can come from renouncing that, then I can cultivate that right resolve. And again, and then he says, and that's when I became a monastic, and I went off and I did all the things in seclusion and all the things, and and I entered the first jhana, and I remained there. And again, this came up last week, and this is not, you can do your own research on oh, this is just cosmic woo-woo and yada yada. I think what I would say about that is, I always find it interesting when people who've never actually spent any real authentic, like legitimate amount of time meditating have all kinds of opinions about what meditation can and cannot do. Don't you find that a little strange? And if you participate in that, then I might ask you to reflect on, don't you find that a little strange? I would also say there's a lot of research that you can find, brain scans of people who meditate. Okay, so this is real. It's not like just because someone can't access it doesn't, and just because they can't access it doesn't mean they can't access it ever. It could just mean they don't believe they can access it. That enough means they can't access it. What the thinker thinks, the prover proves. And again, I realize that I'm getting myself into trouble, but I don't care, because I'm not getting paid. I don't have an algorithm. Nobody really listens to the show. No offense to the people who do. I'm not saying you're nobody. Thank you for listening. But I think you know where I'm going with this. You know what I mean? So again, Buddhism is not for everybody. And I would say that, it is, but it isn't, right? Because it's just a path. It's just a path. And to my view, people who listen to my podcast know, don't contort Buddhism to make it be what you want it to be because it makes you uncomfortable. Perhaps consider a different path or a different approach to Buddhism, maybe. I don't know. I don't know enough about other paths in traditional Theravāda Buddhism. And from what I understand in Zen as well, again, I don't know much about Zen, you have to sit your ass down and meditate. And if you don't do that, you don't have a leg to stand on. At least that's my understanding from what I've read. That's all. You know, it's not like it's some special, no, man. You cannot see for yourself if you're barely keeping yourself alive and you've got 3 kids and maybe you're living in a war zone and all of this is just bullshit for you. And you're right, it is. It's complete bullshit. You know, like if I was to say what I'm saying right now to my 5-year-old self as I was being diddled with, I'd want to punch myself in the fucking throat. So I can appreciate that. And I think one of the greatest gifts that I know I can give myself is really this practice right here, you know, where because I do struggle with anger and I am very, very hot, you know, I'm very hot-blooded. And so some people are naturally chill, man, or maybe you're someone who kind of lives in a fawning state all the time and you think you're chill, but you're really not. You're like living in a constant traumatized state of I have no needs, I have no boundaries because I never was allowed to have them. And so I think I'm easygoing, but I actually just have no sense of, you know, where I end and someone else begins. And this is not to shame you. This is to say, hey, this is why Al-Anon was invented. Okay. I think, all of us, wherever we are, have access to this stuff, you know? And whatever our shtick might be, for me, it's anger. And so I have to mind my right speech. And I'm really looking forward to getting into right speech because my wrathful compassion, that is the albatross for me, is, Sarah, are you sure you're not moving into contempt? Are you sure you're not moving into hatred because you're mad? You're mad because you want things the way you want them to be. Are you sure? Are you sure? You know, I have to ask myself that all the time, you know? So anyway, so there it is. And I'm going to keep on reading. So Sutta 163, then you should train yourself thus. Goodwill as my awareness release will be developed, pursued, given a means of transport, given a grounding, steadied, consolidated, and well undertaken. That's how you should train yourself. When you have developed this concentration in this way, you should develop this concentration with directed thought and evaluation. You should develop it with no directed thought and modicum of evaluation. You should develop it with no directed thought and no evaluation. You should develop it accompanied by rapture, not accompanied by rapture. Endowed with a sense of enjoyment, you should develop it endowed with equanimity. When this concentration is thus developed, thus well developed by you, you should then train yourself thus. Compassion as my awareness release. Empathetic joy as my awareness release. Equanimity as my awareness release will be developed, pursued, given a means of transport, given a grounding, steadied, consolidated, and well undertaken. That's how you should train yourself. When you have developed this concentration in this way, you should develop this concentration with directed thought and evaluation. You should develop it with no directed thought and a modicum of evaluation. You should develop it with no directed thought and no evaluation. You should develop it accompanied by rapture, not accompanied by rapture. Endowed with a sense of enjoyment. You should develop it endowed with equanimity. And that comes from AN 8:63. And then Ṭhānissaro Bhikkhu has in brackets here, see the remainder of this passage at Sutta 254. All right, so I'm back. Per the usual, I asked AI to unpack this and talk to me like I'm 5. And this sutta really are, to my view, and Robot agrees, it's training instructions. It's instructions on training the mind. And I remember when I discovered Buddhism as a young woman and I was learning to meditate for the first time. And I remember how I can't think of I'm trying to think of an adjective to really describe how foreign and unavailable to me meditation felt at that time. And, the teacher explained to me that, it asked me if I'd ever had a puppy or a dog, or, I never had a young animal. And, I'd said I had. And, he said, would you punish the puppy every time it didn't pee on the mat, it peed on the hardwood floor? Would you kick it? Would you hit it? Would you punish it? And as he went on, what he was trying to explain was that our mind is like that. Our mind is untrained. And so we have these instructions here that will help us to train the mind. I keep trying to hold for plane, by the way, but the airport near my house just opened, and so they're just letting loose. So I'm just gonna let it go. The puppy story. The other thing that the teacher told me at that time, was, besides the fact that my mind was the puppy, and my mind was the untrained puppy, is that to cut myself a lot of slack, to forgive myself over and over and over and over and over again when I peed on the floor. When I struggled and struggled and struggled in training my mind to sit. So here it is. Here's the instructions that the Buddha presents. Start with one good feeling. Goodwill. Goodwill. To my view, this is very, very difficult for me to explain. So I think I'm just going to avoid even trying to attempt to explain like what's actually phenomenologically happening when I meditate. I'll just say that I know that my job is to, and I have a lot of tricks that I use, is to begin, okay, back it up. When I sit down on the cushion, it takes a little time for my mind to quiet. And I just sort of sit through that. Let it buzz, let it hum, let it sing, let it beat itself, let it shriek, let it, just the mind, the raging mind. By the way, it can feel like that, I find, the more subtle it becomes, but those words sound negative, and it's not, hard to explain. I don't find it negative. I find it part of the training. Just like when we work out, especially as you get older, but also you young people out there, you really should warm up first. You need to warm up your body before you run that 10 miles or get on that bike and go 50 miles or do that Orange Theory class or whatever it is that you're doing. It's not like during the warm up, I hope anyway. And if you are, oh, bless your heart, please stop it now. Okay? But I hope when you are warming up that you're not beating yourself up. What's wrong with me? Why can't, so it's you recognize that it is part of the training. Start with one good feeling, the Buddha says. So then our job becomes, and again, I'm not saying this is the right way. I'm saying this is the way that, at least to my understanding in the Theravāda tradition, this is the way that Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha, trained his Sangha, his community, how to sit. It's how he sat. So metta can be extremely helpful. It can be an extremely helpful mechanism. At least for me, people use metta in different ways, and every mind is different, But metta can be a really handy, and to my view, for my mind, it's a necessary engagement, mental effort that I need to make to begin to meditate. Start with one good feeling, good will. So that is the essence of metta. So at the end of my meditation, I do what Robot suggests Buddha means here. I do it. But I also do it throughout the entire meditation. And if my mind is really out there, which can happen sometimes, then I'll use some Kundalini yoga that I won't talk about here. I'm not, I don't want to bring that in here. I'll just say that that's what I do, and that can help me, quiet the mind. Metta, may I be well. May I be happy. May I be at peace. May others be well. May they be happy. May they be at peace. So when I'm doing this is very subtle here for me personally. I'm just going to tell you my experience. That's all I can offer. I can't offer anything else but my experience. This is extremely subtle. I will repeat this, and I will repeat this while using focused meditation, concentration meditation, single-pointed meditation, different names for it. I will use this until I feel it in my heart. Until I feel it in my heart. In other words, look, if you're sitting down meditating and wondering why you can't feel genuine compassion for the people in the world that terrify you, that's quite normal. Quite. And so then it becomes, this is why it's called a training. This is why this sutta is instructions for training the mind. Keep at it. And if that person, if the person that you bring to mind, there's too much proliferation there. There's too much bound. There's too much shempa. There's too much then drop that person and replace that person in your mind with someone that it's easier to soften the heart around. And I would argue, don't let yourself get up until you feel it in your heart. So you just keep bringing the mind back to that feeling. Even if you're angry, even if you're terrified, you keep bringing your mind back to that feeling. May you be well. May you be at peace. May you be free from suffering. And then just sit still with that. I don't even want to use the word notice, because notice is an action, and which means you're now officially in the way. Your cognitive mind is in the way. So, and again, hey, everybody has different ways of meditating. I'm just kind of telling you what I do, my understanding of what, the Buddha's instructions were. So, anywho, coming back to the sutta itself. So the text says, hey, develop this. Keep practicing it. Keep practicing it. Don't take it for granted. So if you've listened to the podcast, then I meditate every day. And yeah, there are days, like going through some very sad and scary stuff with my old cat. And I had to miss the other day, and root canal, and I overslept. And, so life does happen. And remember, you don't want to beat yourself up. This is to help us greet life, not build more walls between us and life. But outside of that, practice. Then at least you can tell yourself if your experience of things are terrible, then at least you can have something to say, hey, maybe if I tried this, I'd feel better, right? And you may and you may not. But what's so great about meditation is it almost doesn't matter. There's a sense of, I don't want to get into all of that. Just sit. And you're going to have to sit a while. It's not going to happen right away. It might take years. It certainly did for me. You return to it again and again. You make it stable. And you don't let the mind wander away from it. So it's hard work. There's a lot of effort there in this particular way. Now, I know in this much I do know about Zen, or I should say their meditation practice, which is called Zazen. And I've sat Zazen many times. And I do love Zazen. I think it's beautiful and I get it. And I don't want to try to pit these two ideas against each other at all. Zen is much more about just not doing anything with the mind, just sort of letting the mind be, the observer. And again, I don't want to get out of my lane. Well, all of this, Buddhism in general, in terms of the academic knowledge base, yeah, I'm a chump. But I've already told you that in every episode, so nothing's changed. Still not a monk, still not a nun, still a chump. So I think this is my opinion. Obviously, all of this is my opinion. Duh. I think sometimes people think that, if you practice this every day, then your mind is just like this all the time, every day. To a certain degree, one definitely feels. So at any rate, getting back to the sutta here. So he explains, you bring it into mind, you focus it, and you focus it, and you focus it, and you concentrate it. Hear that train? Maybe not, but I do. It sounds fantastic. And then as you do this and you focus on that feeling, the mind becomes more quiet. As you continue on, as you continue on in your meditation, in other words, if you're, the longer you sit, the more terrain you're covering, possibly. I mean, it just depends on the mind that's doing the sitting. But the Buddha describes what happened for him. He says, as his concentration deepens, different feeling states arose in his mind body. Rapture, so just a strong, uplifting joy or energy. And yes, I have had that experience, and it is incredible. It's profound, it's moving. If you can come out of that without crying, wow, I want to shake your hand. Enjoyment, pleasure. So he said that those feeling states arose. A comfortable happiness in the body. This is something that makes meditation, for me, quite enjoyable. Is these feelings of enjoyment and pleasure and equanimity that do kind of come in. And anyway. And then he says, notice how the mind behaves in all of these different states. And that is, to my understanding anyway, that's the observer piece that you often hear about when people talk about Buddhism. The observed and the observer. So that's the observed and the observer piece of Buddha's instructions on meditation. That you use concentration to settle and quiet the mind, and if you do it long enough, you'll go through states, and you pay attention. You pay attention to how the mind is responding to these states: clinging, aversion, neutral. And I don't even know if neutral was in the original teachings. I honestly don't know, but I do know that, craving and aversion were in the original teachings. So you just notice, I want more of this. Oh my God, this is so great. Or I don't want this. I hate this. Oh my God, I hate this. So, you're kind of noticing these things arising. You're noticing what the mind is doing with what the mind is doing. And then you repeat this same training with other qualities like compassion, equanimity, empathetic joy. And so you can rest the mind there. Empathetic joy. Relishing someone else's success. We can practice this. And if we notice a pang of jealousy, this is the great time to practice it. So remember, he says, notice what the mind does. I feel jealousy. Don't beat yourself up. Everybody feels jealousy and envious sometimes, it's human nature. Rather, use that feeling state, treat it like a light switch or a button you can push, boop, to remind you, the rubber band that you can snap on your wrist, to remind you to pivot to empathetic joy. You can even do this with your eyes open while you're, maybe not while you're talking to someone, but let's say that you're out to lunch and you're hanging out with a bunch of friends that you went to school with maybe, or that you grew up with. And maybe you're not doing so great in your life right now by your metric. You're not happy with where you're at. You'd always thought you would have been somewhere else by now. And maybe some of the people at the table at that luncheon are doing really well. Maybe they have. As they talk about their life, maybe they have all the things that you want, but don't presently feel that you have. You can feel the jealousy, the envy, all those. Two different feelings, and I don't even remember the distinction between the two, but you feel that rising up in the body mind. Snap the rubber band. For me personally, I release all the breath out of my nose. Well, it's actually kind of a UYG breath. It's kind of like through my nose and the back of my throat. I bring their face into my mind. I can do this with eyes open, so can you. Just listen to them talk and smile. And as you're looking at them, maybe it can even help to put your hand on your heart. Maybe they won't notice that. And just relish how cool it is that someone that you care about, someone that you love, someone that you grew up with, someone that you went to school with, someone's doing so well. That is so fucking awesome, man. I'm so glad to hear it. May you be happy. May you be well. May you be at peace. So these little things that we can bring in all the time, So the training is taking the choppy waves of our own personal ocean and cultivating calm, still mind. All right. I'm going to keep on reading. We are just about done. I can't believe it. We are just about done with right resolve. All right, let's get back to it. So this is the last sutta in chapter 4 in right resolve. Sutta 164. And what are unskillful resolves? Being resolved on sensuality, on ill will, on harmfulness. These are called unskillful resolves. What is the cause of unskillful resolves? Their cause too has been stated, and they are said to be perception caused. Which perception? For perception has many modes and permutations. Any sensuality perception, ill will perception, or harmfulness perception. That is the cause of unskillful resolves. Now, where do unskillful resolves cease without trace? Their cessation too has been stated. There is the case where a monk, quite secluded from sensuality, secluded from unskillful dhammas, enters and remains in the first jhana, rapture and pleasure, born of seclusion, accompanied by directed thought and evaluation. This is where unskillful resolves cease without trace. And what sort of practice is the practice leading to the cessation of unskillful resolves? There is the case where a monk generates desire for the sake of the non-arising of evil, unskillful dhammas that have not yet arisen, for the sake of the abandoning of evil, unskillful dhammas that have arisen, for the sake of the arising of skillful dhammas that have not yet arisen, and for the development and culmination of skillful dhammas that have arisen. This sort of practice is the practice leading to the cessation of unskillful resolves. And what are skillful resolves? Being resolved on renunciation, and in parentheses here, freedom from sensuality, on non-ill will, on harmlessness. These are called skillful resolves. What is the cause of skillful resolves? Their cause too has been stated, and they are said to be perception caused. Which perception? For perception has many modes and permutations. Any renunciation perception, non-ill will perception, or harmlessness perception, that is the cause of skillful resolves. Now, where do skillful resolves cease without trace? Their cessation too has been stated. There is the case where a monk, with the stilling of directed thoughts and evaluations, enters and remains in the second jhana, rapture and pleasure, born of concentration, unification of awareness, free from directed thought and evaluation, internal assurance. This is where skillful resolves cease without trace. And what sort of practice is the practice leading to the cessation of skillful resolves? There is the case where a monk generates desire for the sake of non-arising of evil, unskillful dhammas that have not yet arisen, for the sake of the abandoning of evil, unskillful dhammas that have arisen, for the sake of the arising of skillful dhammas that have not yet arisen, and for the development and culmination of skillful dhammas that have arisen. This sort of practice is the practice leading to the cessation of skillful resolves, and that comes from MN 78. So Ṭhānissaro Bhikkhu leaves the reader here, kind of closes out right resolve with two very pointed, specific sets of instructions. And so here is the second set. The Buddha is explaining, a Buddha, is explaining the two kinds of mental directions that the human mind engages in. This is his claim. Unskillful resolves and skillful resolves. So he's reiterating that unskillful resolves induce and continue to propagate suffering. You know, if you're wanting sensual pleasure all the time, you're wanting sex, you're wanting booze, you're wanting drugs, right? As I've mentioned, I've struggled with addiction throughout my life. There's a lot of suffering there. There is a lot of suffering there. So sensual pleasure, the six sense media is our connection with sensual pleasure. The Buddhists suggesting that constantly looking to feed it is a source of suffering. And if you've experienced any kind of wanting or craving of a particular kind of sensual pleasure, scrolling on your phone when you're bored, that's sensual pleasure. Stimulating your eyes, stimulating your ears, sensual, the senses. Anger towards people. This, as I've mentioned before, this is something that I really get to work with in my life. It's been a pain point for me for the last couple of years. I continue to work with it. And yeah, it can lead to a lot of suffering, anger. And in Buddhism, anger has all kinds of shapes and forms. And I'm kind of hoping maybe even in the next chapter, right speech, that we'll get to talk a little bit about that, wanting to hurt someone, hatred. So all of these cause a lot of suffering in our own mind. And so I realize that I'm at the hour here, and I do feel like I'm blathering on and on. So I'll just kind of leave it with some final thoughts on this last sutta in chapter 4 on right resolve. So it seems to me that what the Buddha is describing here is an equation. Perception, our individual subjective perception, leads to intention, which thereby leads to action. So sensuality perception, Buddha's talking about this here, sensuality perception will create sensual intention. Now you might be thinking, that's ridiculous. I'm married. I want to produce sexual intention with my spouse, preferably every night, perhaps you're thinking. I don't know what you're thinking. My understanding, remember I'm not a scholar, again, is that he's speaking of the monastic life here. And I would imagine too that, I don't know that the Buddha, I don't know, right? But I don't know that the Buddha would have imagined that someone could attain what he's describing unless they shuffled themselves off somewhere and removed themselves from sense media experience by and large. But again, I think the great example that I can come back to, at least I think it's a prominent and excellent example of how deep this particular well is Epstein. You can see his sort of craven, really sensual desires that produced a craven sensual intention in him. I wrote a Substack post recently about Epstein as well, actually after I made that particular episode, if you listen to it. Part of what I wrote about in there is a particular view that one can hold of another human that they deem less than, insignificant, so insignificant and irrelevant, in fact, to their perception, that they are barely human at all, that they are a thing to be dominated. So to my view, this is how deep, this particular well can go with sensuality. I think a good example would be to look at Epstein. So I think if you're a layperson, a very practical view is to recognize the sensuality within us and to consider that if we ruminate. I was talking to somebody recently about this. Oh my gosh, I'm going way over. Okay, I really will try to keep this super short and then we'll wrap it up. We were just talking about what a crush feels like, and if you're unfamiliar with that word, I'm a Gen Xer in the United States. A crush would be like a intense desire and longing for someone. And it may or may not involve sexual desire, it just depends on the individual. And how kind of coming back to that fire property, how fiery that is, how much it can consume you. And in a way, if you've ever experienced it, I know I have, it can really kind of make you lose your mind a little bit, or you feel like you're losing your mind. So at any rate, yeah, if we can recognize the causal chain here, there's a lot of wisdom in that. So he's just describing the process of training our perception very deliberately, very regularly. It's more about the action, the doing of. So anyway, I'm gonna stop now. Sorry to put you over here, but we have come to the end of chapter 4 in Right Resolve. And so in the next episode, we'll be picking up at the top of page 279, if you're following along in the PDF. And here it looks like Ṭhānissaro Bhikkhu combined right speech and right action. And so this is going to be good stuff. So if you've been listening, thank you for listening. And I hope that you found something useful here. Yeah. And take good care of yourself.